So hello and welcome. I am Diane Kludzik. I'm the Director of Marriage and Family Life in the Diocese of St. Petersburg. And along with Sabrina Burton-Schultz, our Director of Life, Justice, and Advocacy, we welcome you to this webinar entitled Effective Strategies for Helping Families Suffering Abuse. We're grateful to members of the Diocese of St. Petersburg for joining us, and also excited to welcome participants from other dioceses and organizations. In October, the Church celebrates Respect Life Month and the month of the Holy Rosary, and our diocese is well into the 40 Days for Life campaign. And nationally, October is also Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And since our U.S. bishops have issued a statement on this life issue, we want to assist our parish leaders and those beyond our diocese in addressing this situation pastorally. Through the Secretariat of Laity, Marriage, Family Life, and Youth in the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, we have been introduced to the work of Catholics for Family Peace, and we link to their great work, their website, regularly in our office emails. Last year, I had the opportunity to participate in a webinar given by Laura Yeomans of Catholics for Family Peace, who we have invited to be our presenter tonight. And Laura will tell you a little bit more about herself in a few minutes. So our topic tonight is not an easy one to address. And so let us begin with prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Loving God, we gather here today, remembering those who are affected by violence and abuse. We come with our request to you and ask that you hear our prayer. Alone, we can do nothing. With your guidance and blessing, we can move mountains. Open us to the problems in our neighborhoods. Ever living and loving God, you provoke us to the challenge of our time. Keep us constantly aware to the concerns of violence. Inspire each of us to know the urgency of your call to address the many needs that surround us. Give us the fortitude to respond to the tasks before us according to your will. Be with us today, loving God. Comfort us, but not protect us from the work that needs to be done. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
I'm happy to welcome our presenter, Laura Yeomans, who is the program manager of the Parish Partners Program at Catholic Charities in the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., and also serves as faculty associate for Catholics for Family Peace. Just a reminder to mute yourself during the presentation, and if you have any questions, if you would place those in the chat. So welcome, Laura. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to come, Diane and Sabrina. Thank you for your dedication, your compassion, your desire to serve parish families that are suffering right now, suffering domestic abuse right now. I'll give you a little bit more information about myself. I have the blessing to serve as a manager of an emergency response team. So we go out when pastors call us, they have a family facing an emergency need, and many times that's domestic violence. And we try to care for those families. I manage our outreach program, a domestic violence outreach program for Catholic Charities in the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. And I've had the opportunity to work in domestic violence shelters, to actually run a domestic violence program at a Catholic church in the Columbus Diocese when I lived in Ohio. And I've had the opportunity to serve as a panelist and presenter at 2 of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops conferences. So that's a little bit about me. Tonight, we have the opportunity together to learn more about domestic violence. My goal is that I hope to increase your ability to save lives, because in every parish, there are families that are coming to Mass, participating in the life of the church, and who are also suffering domestic violence. So my hope is that together, we're going to increase your capacity to recognize domestic violence, know some steps about how to respond in a way that will be most supportive to families suffering, and how to refer people to get more help. I'm going to talk with you also about some of the key warning signs that a domestic violence murder might occur, because some of the families are experiencing severe and high levels of violence. And I want to alert you to some of those warning signs. We're also going to step back and say, now, if someone is experiencing domestic abuse, what are their concerns? So that's what I call here the third bullet: identify the risk assessment issues that survivors are worried about. We're going to look at that. I'm going to refer you to a couple of ways to get information that you can pass out to your parish and how you can connect people with help. And we're going to spend some time looking at what the recommendations are from the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. They have a wonderful statement that's going to be of great help to us. You know, recently here in Washington, D.C., a young father beat his wife. Their little baby was right there, and he beat her and kicked her, and she tried to dial 911 and fell unconscious. But fortunately, the ambulance came and took her to the hospital, and her life was saved. When she got out of the hospital, she came immediately to her church. And at her parish, we had done workshops with parishioners, with leaders, with the Franciscan brothers, and they knew how to respond. They welcomed her. And when she said she was afraid of being killed, and she had her baby in her arm, she was afraid the next time that he might kill her, we and the parish knew how to help her. And in that moment, we helped to save her life. And we helped her with emergency food and an emergency bus card, and also helped her learn about a protection order. And she changed her situation from being one where she might have been killed to one where she was safe and living with her cousin, and her little baby was safe. And I hope for you that this workshop will enable you to take steps yourself in your parish, to take steps, so that if someone came to you in a similar situation, you would know things to say and steps to take that might help save their lives. I'm from a wonderful Catholic charity, so I wanted to give you just a word or two about my wonderful program so you know where I'm coming from. Our domestic violence outreach program is led by a priest advisory committee. And those pastors have a heart of compassion and have seen so much suffering in their parishioners from families experiencing domestic abuse. But they have set a goal for myself and my team about what outreach we would do, what materials we would create. And we created bulletin inserts and prayers of the faithful and a pastor's resource packet. And by the way, all of these materials are available to you. I can give them to Sabrina and Diane. You can download them from our website, because we want to share what we've created in any way that might help you in your ministry. In our ministry in DC, we also help parishes develop domestic violence ministries. And I'd be glad to talk with you about that if that interests you. And then we provide emergency assistance. So that was just a little bit about our program. Everything that we do at Catholic Charities, and I urge you, I'm sure that as Diane and Sabrina work with you, everything that you do could be based in the guidance from the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. And they have wonderful recommendations. And if you'll notice here, and these are direct quotes from this pastoral statement, they recommend that the intervention that the church, the parish, that we as first responders can offer, that the top priority is that we think about safety for the victim, safety for someone surviving domestic abuse, for her or him and their children. But that is the top concern. And in fact, the best question we can ask people if someone reveals they're suffering domestic violence is, what step would you like to take to feel safer? And you'll hear me say this a couple times during the workshop, but what step would you like to take to feel safer? Now, Another goal that the bishops have called us to is accountability for the abuser. This workshop today does not focus very much on that. That's a different topic of how to work with people who are abusive to their own family members. But I'll say a couple of things about it. Accountability is much, much more than, I'm sorry I hit you, I'll never do it again. Accountability is encouraging someone who's using force and fists and kicks and threats to recognize the harm they are inflicting, to take responsibility for it, to recognize that it's a choice, to go for counseling, to change their behavior. So the accountability is a complicated thing. And of course, with prayer and counseling and a commitment to change is possible. Now, the third goal from the bishops, is restoration of that marriage relationship, if it's possible, or mourning and support for the family if their separation is needed in order for the family to be safer. And in many situations, we have found that it is very difficult for someone who has used a fist, a knife, a gun against his family members for him or her to change their behavior. So we oftentimes are looking for ways to support people as they're mourning the loss of that relationship. Now, you and I are in the category of first responders, and the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops here urges us to first listen and believe the victim's story. And as I've worked for many years within the church, you may have a situation where it's hard to believe. But what we have found at Catholic Charities and my work as a pastoral associate is that it can even include choir leaders, deacons. It can include leaders in the parish. Fine, upstanding families can be suffering domestic violence at home. So we listen and we believe. The second step is we'll help assess the danger. And I'm going to give you some tips about how to do that, how to help assess the danger. And then the bishops call us to refer people for counseling, to learn about other services that can help people suffering abuse and make referrals. And actually in this statement from the pastoral statement, the bishops themselves list this number that's at the bottom of the page. And so I want to ask you to take your phones out right now. I want you to leave this workshop with the National Domestic Violence Hotline number. The bishops recommend that when we are supporting families who are suffering, that we connect them with this national service that is then going to tell them and connect them to a local program. Because local domestic violence programs will do safety planning. They may have pro bono legal assistance. They'll have emergency shelter, different kinds of help that could make a difference in that family getting to safety. So that number at the bottom is 1-800-799-7233. And I hope we all now have that in our cell phones. Please take a note at the bottom, at the very bottom of the page. It says, the bishops wrote, it is important to note that when dealing with people who abuse, couple counseling is not appropriate and can endanger the victim's safety. So you have a couple that comes forward and they say, we'd like to have counseling together, but they also reveal that he has threatened her with a gun, he's choked her before, he's punched her, he's hit her. And the bishops know from their own experience, and at Catholic Charities, we've found the same thing, that in a situation where abuse is present, physical abuse is present, the woman or man suffering the abuse cannot speak honestly for fear that when he or she goes home, the abusive partner might kill her, might hurt her, might punish her with more violence. So that's a very helpful, we root all of our work at Catholic Charities in our outreach on domestic violence in this statement from the bishops. So if you're thinking about starting a ministry yourself, we always, and I'm working with several parishes right now that are starting ministry. This is the place to start, reading and learning from this document. So now I wanted to share with you that as you open this ministry, as you invite people to come for help, actually, these are the kinds of cases that we see that are referred by our pastors here in our archdiocese. And so it's very possible that you also would see these kinds of difficult cases, threats to kill, murders, actions related to suicide. You know, one deacon had told me that he had a young woman who was experiencing domestic abuse, and then she herself committed suicide out of hopelessness, that there was no hope available. Also concerning suicide, we had another case where in the Mass and at church, the family presented themselves as loving and supportive, but at home, he was insulting his wife and encouraging her to commit suicide and telling her he was worthless. So you might see some complicated cases. So I encourage you, study first. Study the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops statement. Read Dr. Christoria Welland's book, How to End Violence, Domestic Violence in Catholic Families. Have a study period before you launch your ministry, because some of the cases that may come forward will be shockingly horrific and in great need of our help. The reality is that 1 out of 4 women, 1 out of 7 men have experienced severe physical violence in an intimate relationship, that's being kicked, beaten, choked, burned, having a weapon used against them. 1 out of 4. So think about the number of families that come to Mass over the weekend. You know, we just spoke at St. Matthias in Lanham. There's 6 Masses. So let's say there are 1,000 families, maybe more, that came to St. Matthias that weekend. You could have 250 women in your parish who have experienced severe physical violence. Now, some of those women may have separated and are now living in a safer place, but some women in your parish are going home to domestic violence situations. And if you combine the rate of sexual violence, stalking with physical violence, look at the statistics there. At the number of women, you could have 1 out of 2, 1 out of 3 women in your parish who've experienced some combination of severe physical violence, stalking, or sexual violence in their own home. To put this in another perspective, if you remember back to the Vietnam War, there were years when we were at war in Vietnam, and there were 58,000 soldiers that were killed during that time, and 54,000 women in their homes were killed in those same years in the Vietnam War. 54,000 mothers, daughters, cousins, grandmothers. So the epidemic of violence is quite severe. If you're looking for a ministry, you have one right in your own parish. You can support families who are suffering the reality of domestic violence right now in your parish. I would like to share with you a true story. It's Lisa's story. Now, Lisa is not her name. Actually, this is a story I created as a presentation tool, but as I have given it, then families have come up to me and said that this was their story. So on behalf of the families who've suffered similarly to this story, I present you a true story. Now look here at the screen. I hope everyone's on Zoom so you can see that I have some boxes, and these represent, parts of our life that we often take for granted. We have friends, we have a good relationship with our family, we have freedom of movement, we have cell phones, and so on. So just observe as I share the story of what happened to Lisa, what happens to the supports that we kind of take for granted in our own lives. Lisa is a young professional And she fell in love with her husband, who's also a professional. They were both working full time and they fell in love. And Lisa thought they would have this wonderful life together. And they had 2 kids. One of the things that happened to Lisa is that if she was on the phone with her friends, if she was hoping to have a lunch with a girlfriend, her husband became very jealous. He became very accusatory. He accused her of cheating, planning to cheat on him, and became so upset and angry that Lisa actually stopped seeing her friends. I'm going to wipe that box away. She gave up her friends to kind of have more peace at home. Now, Lisa had a strong relationship with her parents and her sister, but her husband began to lie to her parents. And her husband was a professional. He spoke very well, but he lied to her family about her. He accused her of child abuse. He accused her of being abusive and mentally ill. And he presented himself that he was the one who was saving the family. He was the one taking care of her and the children. But at home, he was quite abusive toward her. And after a time when he had beaten Lisa, and she called her parents and asked for help and called her sister, and they said no. And he separated her from her family and their support. As I mentioned, Lisa and her husband were both professionals, but her husband sometimes threatened her that if she was going to try to leave for work, he was going to beat her and she would miss work. Sometimes when she did get to go to work, he would call and text her and harass her, and he would say negative things to her boss. Sometimes he would beat her in a way so that she had bruises. And so she didn't go to work, and she lost her job, and she lost another job. Her husband decided to do a renovation on the home and took out and wanted her savings. So they took her savings out of the bank. At the same time, her husband removed all the money from the joint bank account. So in that moment, Lisa has lost her job, her contact with her friends and her family. She has no access to any bank account and no money. So he has a salary, and she has to beg him for money to buy things for the family, including food. And she and the kids are hungry. And sometimes when she begs him for food, he beats her. So she tries not to ask. Also, he insults her and calls her all sorts of ugly names and says she's ugly and fat. And he requires that before she eat or drink anything, she must ask his permission, either in person or by text, or she has to call him. Even if she wants to make a cup of tea, she has to ask her husband for permission. So he has increased a significant amount of monitoring and control over her. And she does not have enough food in her life. He takes away some pain medicines that she was given by her doctor. She doesn't have health insurance now. She doesn't have medical care. She cannot replace those medicines, and he tells her to grow up and deal with that. With all of this happening, she has now become traumatized. And the effect of trauma, of having your loved one, your cherished husband, hurt you, insult you, take away your resources and beat you, means that she suffers from confusion and difficulty planning and has a very low self-worth. And she forgets to renew her driver's license. And this was back a couple of years when you had to go in person. And she had to stop driving. Every day when her husband comes home, he checks her cell phone. What websites did you look at? Who called you? And he calls the people back who called her. Why did you call my wife? Lisa doesn't use her cell phone anymore. She doesn't want to be beaten up when her husband comes home. Her husband decided a day at the beach is what the family needed. But not her. He said she could not come. He packs the car, takes the kids. He doesn't come home. And he doesn't come home. And he doesn't come home for 2 weeks. And she's frantic. And she misses those children. They're the most important thing in her life. When he comes home, he says, if you ever tell anyone what's happening here, if you ever leave me, I'll get custody of those children and you'll never see them again. And Lisa is traumatized and she's not working, and he's damaged her reputation with her own family. And she doesn't know that she still has equal rights to those children. And she's afraid. She's very afraid she won't have custody. And then her husband begins to take the children out as he goes to work. He drops them off for school. And he puts a piece of paper on the top of the door. And he says, if that piece of paper isn't there when I get home, you'll be sorry. Now, Lisa can't use the phone. She can't talk to her friends or her family. And now she can't open the doors to her own house for fear that when her husband gets home, he'll hurt her. And sometimes the wind takes that piece of paper off. She never opens the door. And she's beaten so badly, she's taken to the hospital. And in that moment, she's lost her freedom of movement, her mental health, her physical safety, and what is left? And for the Lisa that is living now in your parish, I pray that your church is what is left, that she can still come to church and she can still talk to one of you and she can ask for help. Because I've seen situations like this. And in one situation, the young woman, a piece of paper on the door, and he beat her terribly and she was hospitalized. And at the church, we helped her pay for a little tiny apartment for herself and her baby. And we gave her food and clothing, and we helped her find some furniture, and we included her in a women's group. And we supported her in taking steps to be safe. Because as violence passes over time in family situations, it frequently just gets worse. So if he's hospitalizing her, hurting her so much that she's hospitalized, the next time he could kill her. I'm going to talk with you about the characteristics of domestic violence, but I also want to just pause a moment and check in with Diane or Sabrina if at this point there were any questions that have come through from our participants.
I've not seen any questions yet, but if anyone would like to place a question in the chat, perhaps you could direct message it to me, to Sabrina.
Okay, well then I'll continue, but feel free if you have a comment or question, you can forward that to Sabrina. And I want to give a thank you to everyone who's participating today. This is a difficult subject. Thank you for your interest and compassion and your intention to help your fellow parishioners who are suffering. But let's look at this chart together. So as we think about Lisa and what she experienced, on the outside of this circle, there's physical violence. Often there's also sexual violence. And the purpose of that violence is power and control. And many spokes of the wheel may be present. Certainly for Lisa, we saw that he intimidated her and threatened her. He hit her. If we look at emotional abuse, he insulted her, called her fat and ugly, and he put her down. He dismissed her concerns. He isolated her. Isolation is key in the families that we see. He cut her off from her friends, cut her off from her family, stopped her from working. And there's economic abuse. He cut off her savings. He cut out the joint savings account. And I work with other domestic violence organizations, and some of our allies were saying that in like 95% of the cases they serve, there is economic abuse. There's cutting off of the credit cards or misuse of the credit cards to run up debt, and a lack of sharing, mutual sharing of resources that are coming into the family. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. Many times the person who's abusive is going to blame the victim for those abuse. You know, you opened the door, therefore I have the right to beat you up. denying her pain and suffering, blaming her for what he is inflicting, not taking responsibility for the use of his own fists, blaming someone else, misusing the children. So it's possible in a parish situation that we may not see physical violence, but we may see emotional abuse occurring in the way people treat each other or in the lack of freedom. I can't come to this, my husband won't let me. We may see warning signs that domestic violence is occurring by watching out for some of the spokes of the wheel here. If we have the opportunity to speak to someone who's suffering domestic abuse, they will be somewhere in this wheel. So the cycle of violence, there's a honeymoon period. They fall in love and they think they're wonderful. Each other are wonderful. And they have promised to love and respect and stay together forever and build a family life together. There's a honeymoon. And then there's tension and difficulties and an explosion of violence. And after the violence, the first time, there's an apology. I'm so sorry. I will never do this to you again. Please forgive me. And many times, women and men do forgive. And they do rely on that promise never to have it happen again. And unfortunately, unless people take steps to go for counseling in programs that are certified to help people who are abusive, it is very difficult for people to take steps to recognize their own violence and take responsibility for it. So the honeymoon may start up. He may bring home flowers, bring home gifts, go on a vacation together, and hopes are reestablished that the union will last and be wonderful, and then tension starts again. But the second and third and 10th and 15th time violence occurs, there's usually a terrible escalation of violence. Now, when we have the opportunity to speak to someone, there's somewhere on this wheel. And I hope that you will deepen your resolve to be patient with people who may change their mind. Let's say you have the opportunity to talk with someone. Her husband has just injured her, threatened her. She's terribly afraid. Come to the church for help. And you offer to connect her with the National Domestic Violence Hotline. You get her connected so she does safety planning. And then she goes back. And then the tension starts again. And then the violence occurs again. At the church, what we need to do is to consistently be one who listens, one who thinks about safety, regardless of if you've gone back, if you're coming now for help. I want to help you. And I believe in the right of each person to decide for themselves what is the best thing to do. You and I don't know the number of threats that someone is experiencing, how difficult their economic situation is, what their options are, what their parents are saying, what their pastor is saying. So we need to be simply supportive and remember the recommendations of the bishops. What step would you like to be safer? How can I help you? And we offer help and support in steps that they want to take. And we know about the National Domestic Violence Hotline. We know about some of the local resources. Now, Diane has posted a lovely link to a website that has domestic violence programs in your area. And so it would be wonderful for you to also have those available. But so let's remember that someone may suffer a very violent incident and then possibly change your mind. One day I got a call from a young woman. Her husband had beaten her severely. I had took pictures of the bruises on her body. He had held a kitchen knife to her and threatened to kill her. She thought she might die. We helped her. She went to the House of Ruth, which is a local domestic violence agency. She got help. She got a protection order. She was going to be, have the custody of those children. And he was arrested for what he had done to her and the damage he had caused to her. And he was put in jail. And one day she called me and she said, Laura, my husband says he's so sorry and he's never going to hurt me again. And he wants to come home. And he's really asking me if I can go and pay the bail so that he can get out of jail. What should I do? And you see, here she is. She went through the violence in the cycle and the honeymoon is starting. He's saying, I'm sorry. I won't do this to you again. Please forgive me. The church says, the Bible says you should forgive me. And I want to come home and be your spouse. And that's a very difficult phase for people. And we don't tell people what to do at Catholic Charities. And in our training of parish leaders, we recommend the following, which is what I said to her. I said, you have the wisdom within yourself to know what is best for your family. This is your decision. I remember you were afraid that next time he was going to kill you with that kitchen knife. I did remind her of the suffering that she had experienced. So there's a cycle of violence, and hopefully, as we have families come forward, we'll also have men or women who are abusive at home, who are going to be willing to stop and go for counseling and take responsibility of their actions and not keep this cycle going. I'd like to tell you a few warning signs, because in my experience, people sometimes do not know that if a woman comes to you and says, my husband says he's going to kill me, that actually might happen, that is actually one of the warning signs that a domestic violence murder might occur. At Johns Hopkins School of Nursing, they surveyed dozens of families where a domestic violence murder occurred. And they asked what was known, what happened, what did he say, what did she say before the murder, before he killed his wife, what happened? And they found that there were warning signs. If you look at the top 5, has he or she ever used a weapon and threatened her? Has he ever threatened to kill her or the children? And we have this situation. We had a pastor who told us that his female parishioner is married to someone in law enforcement. And she came to him, the pastor, saying, my husband has a gun and he's threatened to kill me and the children. That is a very good indication that a domestic violence murder might occur. So we've got to connect these families to our National Domestic Violence Hotline or one of your local domestic violence programs, because in the research that they did of who was killed, it's something like 94% of the women and men who were killed by their partners never had any contact with a domestic violence program. They never knew that help was available. They didn't know where to go for help. So if you look at these top 5, has he threatened to kill the wife or the children? Does she think he's going to kill her? I'm afraid he's going to kill me. One of our pastors told me of a situation earlier where a young woman had come to him crying that her husband was so abusive, she was afraid he was going to kill her. And at that time, the pastor did not know what was available for help. And they prayed together. And she went home. She came back. She prayed with the secretaries and the office staff. And she was killed by her husband. So this is where you and I can actually help save lives. If someone says this to us, we need to go on alert. This is important. I'm concerned for your safety. Let's call the domestic violence hotline together. I want you to have the best support. For other families where there's been threats to kill the wife or the children, there have sometimes been murders. So we want to help you save your family. Does the abusive person have a gun? Has he or she ever tried to choke you? Now, I had the opportunity to help a Catholic school teacher whose husband had at times choked her. Now, he was also abusing the children. And this often happens that in a domestic violence situation, the children are also victims of violence. And it may be that you and I have been a mandatory reporter. I've been a mandatory reporter twice this month in domestic violence cases. We may have to make reports, but a past choking incident is a sign that the next time, with the neck being so fragile and breakable, that very often then the next time there's a murder that occurs. So I don't have time to give you a lot of detail about all of these today, but I wanted you to see them. And I'm going to make a PDF of all of my slides and send those to Diane and Sabrina so that you can forward them to participants so that you'll have this list so you can think about it. Another warning sign is the abusive person constantly jealous and spying on the other spouse. So I've had domestic violence victims who've come into the parish office. The parish has called me. We've gone over. We're sitting talking about the abuse that's occurring, and her phone rings. And she looks at it and she says, he wants to know where I am. He's monitoring her. He's controlling her. We had a case with someone where the husband would follow the wife to work, spying on her, not trusting her. And that kind of jealousy no longer treats her as a human being with dignity, but as an object to be controlled. And it's an indication that higher violence, greater violence might fall. Have you left him or her or separated after living together or being married? In the moments when a woman or man comes to you and says, I'm afraid and I don't know what to do, they've actually entered a very dangerous period. They're starting to look for help. And it is in the months before and after a separation occurs when we see an augmentation of violence. And at Catholic Charities, we actually lost in the past year a lovely staff person suffering domestic abuse we did not know. And as she separated from this abusive and violent husband, he killed her and himself. So that period, we had a school kid, one of our parish schools. Also, the mom sought a protection order because of the level of violence in the home, trying to get to safety. And she filed for a protection order on Friday, and by Sunday, she was killed by her own husband. So this is also why it's very important for us to be connecting people to domestic violence programs. Domestic violence programs are going to do a safety planning, and they're going to assess the danger for the woman or man that you're trying to help. You don't want to be in this alone. You want to involve people who are working on this with a clinically focused program to help people who are suffering domestic abuse, to try to save those lives, get people into a safety plan of how they're going to survive and not be killed if they try to separate. One of the things that I want to ask you to do is to think for a moment about a family that I'll share with you. This is a parish secretary. Her husband broke her arm and threw her and her 3 girls out in the street. I want you to think for a moment, is it safer for her if she goes back into that house and stays? Or is it safer for her if she leaves? Sometimes when I walk into a parish, what I hear is people saying, well, why doesn't she just leave? He beat her up. Why doesn't she just leave? She should leave. I also hear when I walk into parishes, she should go home and stay and pray and obey. Divorce is a sin. So if you have a situation like we have at Catholic Charities, we're regularly helping people suffering terrible violence at home. We set aside our inclinations. We do not say to people, you ought to leave. We do not say to people, you ought to stay. What we say to people is, what step would you like to take to feel safer? And when we ask that question, and this is consistent with what the bishops are saying, the bishops did not say that the primary thing you should tell people is to go home, stay and obey. And the bishops did not say that you should tell people to leave. What they said is to focus on safety, how to help people be safer. And when you ask that question, what comes back from families that are suffering domestic abuse are these concerns. Their primary concern usually, I find, is the safety of the children. As you talk and as you listen, as you ask this question, they may say to you, I'm afraid for the safety of my children. He said he'll kill the children if I leave. He said if I leave, he'll take custody of the children. I've been to court with domestic violence survivors, and I'll never forget this case. The young man had beaten the woman to a pulp, her baby in the room, and the judge awarded him unsupervised visits of the baby every other weekend. So this woman who knows the terrible violence that her husband has meted out against her, every other weekend will have to turn over the baby unsupervised to the father of the child. And many women will say, I can't do that. I am going to stay at home with the children and suffer the violence, so hopefully my children won't suffer the violence, thinking that the children will be safer this way. Now, on a different related topic, but slightly different, if you as a diocese go forward with this and have the development of domestic violence ministries, you'll want to have a presentation about the effects of domestic violence on those precious children. Because those precious children know what's going on. They hear the abuse, they hear the screams, they see the injuries, and they are traumatized, and their future health and sanity is at risk. But women and men need to think through, and they need help. They need to be connected to domestic violence programs to think through the safety of those children. How are those children going to be kept safe? Safety for oneself. You know, we had a young woman knock on a parish door. She came in and she said, I can't use my cell phone. My husband monitors it. I'm being beaten. I can't leave right now because I don't have all my children with me, but I need help. I need help to save myself. And we need to be there for those people. Safety for extended family. I've had the opportunity to talk with women who are suffering domestic abuse and are very concerned about the safety of their family. So I helped a young woman. She was very concerned. She said, if I leave him, he has threatened that his family back in our country, I think it was Guatemala, his family back in Guatemala will kill my family back in Guatemala. I've worked with African domestic violence survivors who've said, I can't leave him because back in Africa, my family would have to repay all the cattle that was given from his family, gave my family cattle as a bride price, and they would have to give it back, and they are so poor they can't do that. So you will see that the sacrificial Christ in women. If you have the opportunity to serve families that are suffering, you will see people who are sacrificing themselves, trying to keep their family or their children safe. But you and I can make a difference. You and I can show people in our bulletins, in our homilies, in our posters, in our restroom flyers, the specifics of how to escape, the specifics of who is available to help. Now, housing is a key issue. The secretary whose arm was broken and thrown out in the streets, she did return to her husband. And where would she go with 3 little children? She's not going to go and sit on the curb with 3 little children and in our case, in an urban area, and risk the dangers of the night So housing, emergency shelter, assistance with a security deposit, with rent. Many parishes offer some kind of rental assistance, and you can make that available and enable someone to at least have a place to move to be safe as an option if it's housing that's stopping them from seeking safety. Income is very difficult. When I've talked with people who've said, I've got to increase my hours if I'm going to separate, and they plan ahead to try to figure out a way to sustain themselves, because in our area, and I'm sure in your area as well, there's no program that indefinitely is going to provide income support, even though families, victims of domestic violence desperately need that. If your church can offer some economic support for a couple of months, that could make a difference in whether someone gets to safety. And then some of these other issues are very important as well. The difficulty in moving children to a new school. It might be the school is the only safe place they have right now in their lives. Families are going to need legal help. They're going to need help with a protection order. They're going to need help with faith issues. I had a young woman one time come. She had been beaten and abused by her husband for years. And she specifically asked me, would the church let me leave? Would the church accept me if I chose safety? So the bishops are calling us to be present with people who choose safety. And there are a number of faith issues. I'll come back to that in a couple of slides, because I want to share with you some of the ideas of the bishops. But faith can actually be a block or a barrier. It can be misused by the abuser. The abuser may be saying, women have to obey, and you have to forgive me, even though I've beaten you and I'm taking no action to change my behavior. But faith can also be a resource and a guide and a support for families getting to safety. So with all of the concerns that we just looked at, I want to talk about this map, but let me go back here. So if we have safety for the children, for the family, how to escape, housing, income, childcare, legal, we need to know what's going on in our community. So if you're thinking of starting a domestic violence ministry, take a look at the agencies that are already helping. Call them up. Ask them, how do you provide court advocacy? What is the hotline like? What hours is it open? And do you have someone who's Catholic working there? You'd be surprised how many Catholics are working in these agencies that provide support to domestic violence victims. How many Catholic counselors, mental health, domestic violence counselors there are in excellent programs. So mapping out your community is going to enable you better to respond to the needs when we ask, what step would you like to feel safer? And they say, I need to get to emergency shelter. You would know what hotline number is available. I need to talk to a lawyer about custody of my children. You would have some ideas of where to refer people. Let's talk some more about the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. The words on this slide are direct quotes from the bishops. A correct reading of scripture leads to an understanding of the equal dignity of men and women and to relationships based on mutuality and love. And we're all familiar with Ephesians, with wives, obey your husbands. But let's read more of the verses before and after that. Husbands should love their wives as they love their own body, as Christ loves the church. The mutuality of service and loving is an example. The husbands love their wives as Christ loved the church. And then women are following that example and setting their own example and loving their family, following the way Christ has loved the church as well. The bishops wrote, forgiveness does not mean forgetting the abuse or pretending it didn't happen. Forgiveness is not permission to repeat the abuse. I'll give you an example. As a pastoral associate, there was a knock on the door, and this young father came in and said, my wife left me. The church has to make her come back. You have to make her forgive me. This is a young man who had terrorized his family, had beaten his wife regularly. He also had an alcohol problem. In that moment, when he said, she has to forgive me, he had taken no steps for himself to learn that before he hit her and kicked her, he should have practiced forgiveness himself. He needed to take responsibility, that he was responsible for what his hands and feet did and how much he drank. And he was not taking responsibility, but he wanted the church to order her to forgive him and move back home to that unsafe space. And the pastor that I worked with, Pastor Bill Arnold, was wonderful. And our church was wonderful. And we just said, you need to take action to change the violence at home. And we would like to support you in doing that. The third point here, the bishop's right, an abused woman's suffering is not punishment from God. And I have spoken with people who've said to me, God has a plan for my life, and he has brought me this husband, and my husband is beating me and hurting me, and this must be God punishing me for my sin. And the bishops are saying, no, that is not how God responds to sin. God does not send a husband to terrorize a wife. God is a merciful God. God is kind and loving, which wishes safety and harmony and love for each family. And then finally, the bishops write a clear statement. No person is expected to stay in an abusive marriage. A very strong indication, combined with their goals, combined with urging us as parishioners and members of the church to seek safety for families that are suffering abuse. There are things you can do to help. The bishops have, actually, they have more recommendations than even this. But we at Catholic Charities, I'm sure you will be as well, we're really motivated to take on some of the recommendations of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. Include information about domestic violence and local resources in your bulletins. And we at Catholic Charities, we've written bulletin notices that you could use. You could modify them maybe a little bit for Florida, but we'd be glad to send them to you. Put information in your newsletters, on your websites. And, you know, the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops called us about 2 or 3 years ago. I was so honored to get their call. They asked us if they could use a restroom flyer that we developed, if they could use it as their restroom flyer. And they took a design that we had made, and then they improved it, but they kept some of the language. So we have the most wonderful restroom flyer from the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. And on the bottom of it, you can put little tear-off sheets and add the local number for the local domestic violence shelter. And just this week, I'm working with a parish, and for the first time, last week, they put up the restroom flyers. And they were telling me that even just a week later, they saw that people had torn off part of a little slip of paper with the rescue number on it and taken it home. You can be helping save lives by offering at your church to put up the restroom flyers and monitor them and replace them when the little numbers have been taken off as people try to get to safety. The bishops recommend that you keep an updated list of resources. Every year we call all the agencies in our area and we have an updated list. We have excellent training. Have a staff person that goes through in-depth training to really help you understand and learn and be up to date on the different kinds of stalking or violence or remedies that are available. participate in National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, just as Diane and Sabrina are leading us today in this workshop. You can have workshops, you can have tabling. This week alone, I think I have volunteers that are going to be tabling 10 times at different masses, setting up materials, giving a little announcement at the end of the mass, and then passing out materials to teenagers, to adults about what healthy relationships are for the teens, and what teen dating violence abuse is, and also for adults. What is domestic violence? What help is available? And what does the church say, call us to do? So I hope that you'll consider celebrating and doing outreach in October this year and next year in the future. Include a discussion of domestic violence in baptism and marriage classes. And when I had the opportunity to be a pastoral associate, Father Bill Arnold would say to the families coming in for baptism, what is the best gift you can give your family at this time of baptism? And the parents would say, isn't it baptism? And Father would say, yes, of course, but I want you. And he'd turn to the fathers and he would say, I want you to treat the mother of your child as if she was Mary. I want that peace and harmony for you and your family. That is the best gift. At this time of baptism, we're celebrating baptism. I call on you to treat your wife as you would treat the mother of Jesus. Beautiful. But we can incorporate that. And Catholics for Family Peace has a curriculum for marriage classes. So if you're pastor or if there's a retreat center, there's a wonderful curriculum on domestic violence that could be included in marriage prep as well. Take a collection for your local domestic violence program. So these are some of the recommendations of the bishops. I want to share with you my website, www.catholiccharities.dc.org/familypeace. You could use our pastor's domestic violence resource packet. Take the parts of it that are nationwide, change the parts that are for Maryland and DC, and fill in Florida. You could use our call sheets. We have call sheets for parish secretaries. What you could say if someone calls in and says they're suffering domestic violence. We have the restroom flyers that we made and now use the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops flyers, but we can send that to you. We have bulletin inserts. And you see there's my number and my email. And I look forward to having the opportunity to talk with you. I also want to point out to you that Diane and Sabrina have also created a wonderful list of domestic violence resources. And so I hope you'll link to their page because that has important resources that can help you as well. And again, here is my contact information. And I look forward to, I hope that we're going to have a time for a couple of comments or questions. If you have those, and if not, it's just been, I appreciate the honor to be included in your efforts and your concern. And a special thank you to Diane and Sabrina for envisioning this workshop and envisioning offering help to your own families that are suffering abuse. So thank you so much for this opportunity. And let me, Diane, if it's okay with you, I'll go ahead and stop sharing and we can have a time of talking with each other.
That would be great. Sabrina, were there any questions or comments that had come into you?
Well, thank you, Laura. One question came in a little early on. In fact, just after you asked for questions the last time, and you've answered it to some degree, but the question was, would this also apply to individuals? Oh, wait, I lost it when my screen just moved here.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I just lost it. Let me find it again. Would this also apply to individuals dealing with the verbal abuse and threats of violence, but no actual physical abuse?
Well, you did say to me, threats of violence. So once there are threats of violence, then you have warning signs. Now, what I'd recommend is that if you're thinking of doing outreach on domestic violence, that you call your domestic violence programs locally and you ask them if someone is suffering violent threats but they have not actually been physically hurt, do you offer services to them? So that if someone comes in that category, you know which agency they could go to. We ask that question of our program so we have an idea of where we can, refer people. But yes, if there are verbal threats to injure someone, we need to connect them to a domestic violence program that can do an assessment of the safety and talk about safety planning for that family and let them know what other resources are available, especially, for instance, if things get worse. Because oftentimes in a family situation, that cycle of violence is just going to get worse unless counseling and intervention occurs. So that's a good question.
Excellent. Thank you.
Go ahead.
And if a parish doesn't feel equipped to run a full-fledged ministry on their own, is this something that could happen on an interparish level or perhaps even a deanery level?
Well, first of all, to have a full-fledged ministry can mean different things. Often what we will encourage parishes to do is to have an outreach ministry. You don't have to be the people that have an in-depth discussion or do safety planning or know how to alleviate a horrible situation. But you can be the people who say, this is our local domestic violence program, and they offer these services. So we encourage parishes to set up first outreach and information, and you can share the information from the bishops. Now, if people want to go further, what we do with parishes is we set up a series of workshops, and we'll have workshops more in depth of what I shared with you today. And we'll have workshops about why people are abusive, a workshop about that, how domestic violence affects children. I could send you kind of a plan that we use when parishes want to go beyond providing information. The first step I would recommend is that you read the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops statement, and that you look online for, I can send this information to Diane and Sabrina, for a wonderful book called Dr. Christaria Welland, Welland. She has a book called How to End Violence, Domestic Violence in Catholic Families. And she is a Catholic psychologist who works with people who are abusive. But it is a wonderful document based in our Catholic faith about how to help families that are suffering domestic abuse. So start by studying. Start by learning more. Start by calling your local domestic violence program. Ask them what help they need. So we have one parish, they will maybe once a year have a workshop to educate people. They'll put information in the bulletin in September and October. They'll have a homily once a year. And one year they did a fundraiser for the Community Crisis Center, which runs our domestic violence program in Prince George's County. So they gathered gift cards. Find out if there's something that your local domestic violence program needs. So I wouldn't, unless you have mental health counselors with domestic violence experience, you don't want to start a ministry where you are the one counseling victims. That's not the place to start. The place to start is with study and putting information in the bulletin, in the restrooms, doing a workshop, starting with maybe a fundraiser. We have one parish, Our Lady of Mercy, that does a concert, and then they donate the money from the concert to a domestic violence program. Those are the ways that you can, I would recommend that you start.
I don't know what happened to your video. There you go, sit down.
That's perfect. Thank you. Great answer.
Are there any other questions that anybody would like to voice out loud, since we have a small group here? We could do that. Any comments? Mandy? You're muted.
Thank you for getting this organized, Diane and Sabrina. And thank you, Laura, for sharing all of this information. You had said something early on in the presentation about the different workshops that can be done. And one of them you mentioned was when separation has to happen, mourning the loss of the family, resources for that. And I think that's something I would like to know a little more about, and how to present that to people who have to separate from their spouse and have to give up that idea of family because it's just not going to change. So if you could send more information about that, it would be great, because I think a lot of people, including myself, are mourning the loss of the family that we had. And you also mentioned something about trauma, because the person that you're depending on and thinking they're such a great person, all of a sudden they're not, and that's a traumatic thing. So if you could send more information through Diane and Sabrina, I think that would also be really valuable information for families as well.
Excellent. And I would just encourage our friends and family who have needed to separate because of violence to know that the church is calling you to safety, to protect your own life and the life of your children, and that you are loved and welcome and wanted in the church. And we need to give that message to each other. We need to be included. Now, there are some parishes that will do groups that are supportive of families of people who have separated, because we know that people who have separated mourn that loss and need to be supported. So you could have that kind of ministry. I also recommend counseling with programs that have a clinical focus on domestic violence. So if you can find an agency in your area that just focuses on that, that's their specialty, you will get probably the best help in your recovery. And ask, I've been delighted how many times I ask, is there by any chance a Catholic counselor in your program? Because sometimes a pastor will call me and say, this woman needs counseling, but can you get me a Catholic counselor? And many times I can say yes, because we have many Catholics in these kinds of agencies. So you can call and ask about their services in general and get a sense of what they're like, and then look at their materials and feel comfortable that they'll help families with safety planning. And then also ask, do you have a Catholic counselor? Because your parishioners might even feel more welcome than going for counseling there. But thank you for that suggestion that you're interested in. And trauma is something that if you were going to go beyond outreach and just alerting people to the services in the area and support and some faith information about what is forgiveness, if you're going to go beyond that to try to establish a different, a more in-depth ministry, you certainly would want training for your volunteers in trauma. And you would also want to recruit volunteers who are mental health counselors or social workers. We have not only a priest domestic violence advisory committee, so all of our efforts are guided by our pastors, this group of pastors who are wonderful. But we also have 15 volunteer professionals who serve on a domestic violence outreach committee at Catholic Charities. So we have a police detective and mental health counselor and nurses. You could have professionals come forward who could guide you in the outreach and support you in the outreach that you're doing. There may be, I would bet there are nurses and counselors, social workers who'd want to be part of this. Are all of you from different parishes, or are you from the same parish? Do you know each other?
I believe from various different parishes.
Wonderful.
Right. And not necessarily just serving in a role as a pastoral staff member, but involved in the parish, and concerned with the topic, and trying to understand wherever they may be, how they can make a difference, save lives.
Well, thank you again for this opportunity. And I know that your kindness and your interest in serving can really make a difference in the lives of people who are suffering, and also people who have suffered in the past. We'll be so thankful if the church in your area can speak out in support of families who've suffered domestic abuse, try to get help for people.
Laura, we are just so grateful for what you have shared with us. And we're grateful to Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. and Catholics for Family Peace, who had recommended you, and just the ways that you have increased our awareness and our knowledge so that we can better minister wherever we're led, wherever our mission field is. And I really want to thank our attendees for showing up, and for what you will do as a catalyst in wherever you are, where your mission field is, and what this might lead you to further investigate. There's just so many things, Laura, that you shared. Putting up a sign in a restroom can save lives, can change the world. Just so much of what Sabrina and I have been discussing just in preparing for this. There's just so, you learn one more thing. Just before we got on tonight, there was a commercial about being Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I may not have seen that years ago, where I'm just totally attuned to that now, and grateful that that is on during the 6 o'clock news, that we have those opportunities. And I just really want to thank the people of God who have shared their stories with us and have just really evoked an urgency in the collaboration of our offices between Life, Justice, and Advocacy and Marriage and Family Life to keep pursuing this and to increase our awareness and our ability to help educate those in ministry, and that we're all in this together. And so just, so much gratitude, so much gratefulness. And I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their evening, and blessings in wherever your ministry field is. And so thank you and peace.
Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Diane. It's beautiful.
Thanks.
An honor to be with you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Diane and Sabrina.